Alright, in this video we're going to go over spies. So right here we've got my test suite for the date validator that we did before. Nice short little program here. And we've tested all these methods that isValidate relies on pretty extensively. However, you'll notice that even though I've got all these tests and they're all passing, the program actually doesn't work because I'm not actually even using these validating functions inside isValidate. IsValidate is just an empty function right now. So as part of our testing, we need to also be able to guarantee that these little functions that we've created to be used are actually being used. So if I want to know that a function has been called, I'm going to use something called a spy. So here's our describe test suite for the fact that we're even using our validators. So let's start with it uses, what's the name of this one? Has valid length. Uses has valid length. Except let's case that right. Alright. So what I'm going to do is Jasmine has a built-in function called spy_on, and it takes two arguments. If we're doing functions in the global scope like we did in this program here, then the first one will always be window, and the other one will be a string that is the name of the function that we're going to be testing, or the one that we'll be spying on. So I'm going to be spying on has valid length. Now what spies do is they give us some special information about functions. First we need to say, alright, I want you to spy on this function so you can tell me more information about it later. So what we're doing right now is we're telling it to spy on has valid length. Alright, so now we're going to actually call is valid date, and we're going to pass in a date, let's see, 03/13/1991. And then we're going to expect, and then you can actually put the function has valid length. Remember, this is the function that we're expecting to have been called or used in the course of calling isValidate. Dot to have been called. Alright, so we save this, and of course this test fails because we expected has valid length to have been called and it never was. So if we go into here and we call has valid length, save that, now we're passing. However, has valid length really should be receiving the same date that isValidate is receiving. So now we're interested in knowing that it's also being called with the information we need. So there's actually another method called to have been called with, and then let's pass in this string here. Alright, so expected spy has valid length to have been called with that date, but actual call was empty because this was nothing. So we save that, and it's back to passing again. Alright, so now we want to know that if has valid length is false, the main function isValidate should also be returning false. So it fails if has valid length fails. Now here we're going to do something just a little bit different. We're still going to create a spy, but what we're going to do is we're going to also do a little bit more. So we're going to say spy on window again, and then of course the name of the function, which is has valid length. But then we're also going to go to its AND property and we're going to, on that, set its return value. So what we're doing here is we're saying, alright, so I want you to spy on the hasValidLength function, and when that gets called, no matter what it normally would return, I want it to return false. So that way we know that it's going to return false. So you can say expect is valid date of 3/13/1991 to be false. Alright, expected to undefined to be false. Now if you look again here, this function actually isn't even returning anything, and by default a function that doesn't have an explicit return will be returning undefined. So we can return whatever the value of hasValidLength is. Alright, so now we know that our function is being called. We know that if it fails, well, we know that the hasValidLength validator is being called, and that if it fails, the isValidate function will also fail. Now we're interested in all four of our validating functions: hasValidLength, hasValidMatching delimiters, container is integers, and date components are valid. And that is actually going to take just a little bit more setup in order to do all four of them. And the reason why is because once you spy on a function a certain way, you can't spy on that function the same way again inside the same describe block. And that's just an unfortunate eccentricity of Jasmine, but it's pretty easy to work around. So as part of working around that, we're going to use something that's called before each. So what before each is it's a function that will be called before every it inside this describe block. Now before we define what's going on in the before each, let's actually create some variables to hold all the different spies we're interested in. So let's have the length spy, and then let's have the hasValidMatching delimiter spy, and then let's get the content as integers spy, and finally the data components are valid spy. Alright, now before each of these its, we're going to want to actually define these spies and actually give them a value. So let's actually take each of these guys here. Alright. So we're going to set him to be spy on hasValidLength. And we'll just do the same here. And then fix the names. Alright, so we've got our before each, that's setting up all of the spies we're going to be interested in. Now we've got this uses hasValidLength it here, but let's actually change that, uses all validators. Alright, so we no longer have to define that spy. So we are going to want to call this. And we're going to make sure that not just hasValidLength, but also all these other validators have also been called. Again, these are the names of the actual functions. And there's also something in Jasmine where, so for example, I'm not going to want to deal with this because this is actually about to break right now. And I actually want to deal with it right now, so I can actually just put an X in front of it, and that will prevent it from running. Alright, so we've got one test that fails because content is int method does not exist. That is interesting. Let's see here. Ah, that's right, because it's supposed to be content is ints. There you are. Alright, so expected all three of these guys to have been called and with this particular information, but they never were. So let's go back to our code here and actually make that happen. So we've got has valid length. Content is ints. And data components are valid. Alright, save that. And yep, we were successful. So notice that down here it says that executed 8 of 9 tests and it skipped 1, but all the ones that ran were successful. That's because, again, we've got this X in front of this and it detected that. So it didn't run it, and it let us know that we did skip one of our tests, but all the ones we did run were successful. Alright, so now we're interested in seeing, in making sure that it fails if has valid length fails. So instead of having to declare a new spy here, we can actually just reference our existing spy. Save this. Alright, and that fails. So what we're going to want to do is return that, and it's working. However, we don't actually want it to only run, only return the results of has valid length. We want to make sure that it also fails if any of these other validators fail. So let's copy this and edit this. Alright, so let's save the new test. Alright, so it fails all 3 of these because none of these 3 functions are being taken into account when we actually go to evaluate whether or not it's a valid date. So let's turn this into one big Boolean expression. Which should actually be ands. Alright, looks like all 4 of these are failing now. Why is it failing? Expected spy has valid length to have been called with, but was never called. Expected undefined to be false. Alright, let's check out our spec and see what might be wrong here. Okay, that's because we were a little bit hasty there. Oh no, that was fine. Let's see. So it has valid length, content is ints, and date components are valid. Expecting them to be called, but they were never called. Has valid matching delimiters, content is ints, date components are valid, and has valid length. And they're all receiving the date. So it's now no longer passing either that it's using them all or that it fails but just on 3 of them. So one of these is passing. Which one is passing? So we've got has valid length, content is ints, date components are valid. So has valid matching delimiters is actually working the way it's supposed to. Oh, yeah. So that's the reason why. So on this before each, when we create all these spies, what we need to do is we need to default their return value to true. And that makes it so that they're all true before we begin each of these its. And inside the it, for example, fails if has valid length fails. This is where we make sure that its return value is overridden to become false, even though it started out as true. So that makes it nice and neat and easy for us writing this here. Alright, so now we're able to know that it's working the way it's supposed to. I guess one more test that we should probably write is making sure that it passes if all validators pass. And we can simply expect it to be true, because by default with this before each, they're all being set to true. All right. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah, we are passing. All right, and so that's how you use spies to mock functions in Jasmine.